Ireland in the early 19th century was a land that seemed, at a glance, to promise abundance. Rolling green hills stretched for miles in every direction. The soil was rich. The air carried the scent of wild heather and freshly turned earth. There were cattle in the fields, grain waving in the wind, and streams that whispered their way through pastures and glens. It looked like a land where no one should go hungry. But beneath this quiet beauty was a brutal contradiction. The people, who worked this land, who raised the cattle and reaped the crops, were not its owners. They were tenants, poor, overworked, and at the mercy of an absentee ruling class. The vast majority of Irish farmland was owned by landlords, many of whom lived across the sea in England. The system was not just feudal, it was colonial. And in this colony, food became a tool of control. By the early 1800s, Ireland's population had swelled to over 8 million people. It was one of the most densely populated regions in Europe, but wealth and land were concentrated in the hands of a very few. The Anglo-Irish aristocracy, descendants of English settlers loyal to the crown, held enormous estates. These landlords often never even visited Ireland, collecting rent through middlemen and leaving the management of farms to agents who enforced rules without compassion. The Irish Catholic majority were pushed to the edges, both physically and economically. Dispossessed for centuries, they lived in small cottages on rented land, barely scraping together enough to pay rent and feed their families. The vast estates they labored on produced wheat, oats, beef, and butter. But these goods were not for them. They were exported, sent to Britain to feed the empire's growing cities and armies. The Irish people, ironically, were surrounded by food they did not own and could not eat. And so, they turned to the one crop that could sustain them on their small, poor plots of land, the potato. The potato was a miracle and a curse. It grew well in poor soil, required little cultivation, and was nutritionally dense. A small field could yield enough potatoes to feed a large family. For millions of Irish peasants, potatoes were breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Milk, when available, was the only common supplement. In good years, it was barely enough. In bad years, it became a tightrope walk between hunger and survival. This fragile dependence on a single crop would have been risky under any circumstances, but under colonial rule, it was catastrophic. You might ask, why did they rely so heavily on potatoes? Why not grow other food? The answer was simple and cruel. Because the land was not theirs. The best soil, the land that could grow wheat or raise cattle, was owned by landlords who demanded rent. If a tenant didn't pay, they could be evicted, often with little warning. So the Irish poor did not have the luxury of diversifying their crops. They had to grow cash crops for rent and rely on potatoes to feed themselves. It was a system designed to benefit the landowners, not the people working the land. In this system, hunger was never far away. Throughout the early 1800s, Ireland suffered occasional crop failures, but they were regional and short-lived. People would tighten their belts, rely on neighbors, stretch what little they had. There was no margin for error, but there was still hope. That hope began to die in 1845. In the summer of that year, the first signs of disaster appeared. Farmers noticed their potato plants looked sickly. The leaves turned black. The stalks collapsed. Beneath the soil, the potatoes were soft, foul-smelling, and inedible. Entire fields rotted in just days. What started as isolated patches quickly spread. The blight had arrived. It was caused by a fungus-like organism known as Phytophthora infestans. It thrived in the damp, mild climate of the Irish countryside. Once it took root, it moved fast. And it didn't just kill the current crop, it infected the soil, ensuring that the next planting would also fail. At first, there was confusion. No one understood what was happening. People prayed, hoping it was a bad season, a test from God. But the blight returned the next year and the year after that. By 1847, known grimly as Black 47, the situation had deteriorated into full-scale famine. But the hunger was not only the result of the blight. Remember, Ireland was still exporting food. Even at the height of the famine, Irish ports were busy. Ships laden with grain, meat, and dairy sailed regularly to England. It's estimated that during the worst years of the famine, enough food left Ireland to feed its entire population twice over. But that food belonged to the landlords, and the laws of free trade and the priorities of empire said that nothing should interfere with the market. There were no emergency measures to stop exports. There were no food distribution networks to get supplies to the starving. The government in London sent some aid in the early years, but it was minimal, grudging, and quickly withdrawn. Officials like Charles Trevelyan, who oversaw relief, believed in laissez-faire economics, meaning the market should regulate itself. They feared that helping the poor too much would make them dependent. In their eyes, hunger was not a humanitarian crisis. It was a necessary purge. This belief, so casually cruel, would shape the empire's entire approach to the famine. Aid would be minimal. Responsibility would be placed on local communities. And if the poor died, that was simply nature, correcting the surplus. But in the Irish villages, death was not abstract. It was real. It was slow. And it was everywhere. People dug desperately through their fields, hoping for even one good potato. They boiled grass, ate tree bark, chewed on raw seaweed. Parents watched their children waste away, helpless. Bodies were found in ditches, mouths, stained green from eating weeds. In cities, soup kitchens were overwhelmed. Workhouses turned people away. Cholera and typhus spread like wildfire among the malnourished, and still, the land was green. Still, the cattle grazed. Still, the grain ripened. Still, the ships came and went, full of food that the people who grew it would never taste. The famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a colonial one. It exposed the cruel logic of an empire that saw land as profit, people as labor, and suffering as acceptable collateral. The land of plenty had become a graveyard, and the people of hunger, once proud, once resilient, were being pushed to the edge of extinction, not by the weather, not by the blight, but by an empire that refused to care, and the world would watch as Ireland began to starve. The summer of 1845 had begun with promise. The fields of Ireland were alive with green. The potatoes had come up healthy, strong, and full of hope. After years of struggle, it seemed the harvest would be bountiful. But beneath the leaves, something invisible was already spreading. Something that would turn Ireland's lifeblood into poison. It began quietly. A few black spots here and there on the leaves. A strange withering at the tips of the stems. Some thought it was just a wet season, nothing more. But within days, entire plots turned brown and collapsed. Farmers dug into the earth, their hands caked with mud and panic, only to find their worst fears realized. Slimy, decaying potatoes rotted through before they were ever pulled from the soil. The blight had arrived. Its scientific name, Phytophthora infestans, would not be discovered until years later, but its effects were immediate and devastating. Once it took hold, it spread like a sickness through the land. Spores traveled through the air, carried by wind and rain. What was healthy, one morning was black and mush by nightfall. The disease respected no boundary, no family, no village. In just a matter of weeks, the staple food for millions had been wiped out. 1/3 of Ireland's population lived almost entirely on potatoes. Not because they loved them, but because they had no choice. The potato was the only crop that could grow enough food on the tiny, overworked plots rented to Irish peasants. When it failed, there was no backup. No grain in the storehouses, no meat in the pantry, no aid on the road. That autumn, the digging began. All across the countryside, families fell to their knees in the fields, clawing through the dirt. Children helped their parents pull up one ruined tuber after another. Some were partly edible, most were not. Desperation grew with each empty hole. There had been crop failures before. People remembered hard winters, short harvests, times of hunger. But this was different. This was not a poor harvest. It was no harvest at all. In some villages, there were murmurs of a curse. Others blamed the weather, or divine punishment, or even the English. But the truth was worse. No one knew how to stop it, and the worst was yet to come. The year 1846 did not bring relief. Instead, it brought the second wave. This time, it struck harder and earlier. Entire counties lost every last potato plant. Farmers who had managed to scrape by the year before now had nothing, not a single healthy root. Starvation crept in slowly, like fog rolling down the hills, first claiming the weak, then the strong, then anyone left standing. The roads began to fill with the walking hungry, families leaving their cottages in search of food, work, or mercy. Ragged and barefoot, they moved in silence, because speech took energy they no longer had. Mothers carried infants who no longer cried. Old men leaned on sticks, coughing blood. But famine is not just a matter of nature. It's never just about the absence of food. Famine, in its truest and cruelest form, is political. In England, the response was chilling in its detachment. British newspapers reported on the Blight with vague sympathy but little urgency. Officials in London debated whether relief was warranted, fearing it would create a nation of beggars. Economists, safe behind their desks, insisted that market forces would correct the crisis if left alone. In Parliament, there was talk of moral improvement, that the Irish had grown too dependent on a single crop, that perhaps through this hardship, they would be forced to change. There were even those who saw opportunity in the disaster, an excuse to modernize agriculture, consolidate land, and rid the countryside of what they considered surplus population. Charles Trevelyan, the man in charge of administering famine relief, summed up the attitude succinctly. He wrote that the famine was the judgment of God, and that the real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people. This was not aid. This was condemnation. The policies that followed were a twisted reflection of this thinking. The British government shut down the public works programs that had, however inefficiently, given some Irishmen a way to earn wages in exchange for brutal labor. They reduced the funding of soup kitchens. They insisted that Ireland take care of its own poor through local taxation, even though entire communities were already bankrupt. Relief efforts, when they came, were wrapped in bureaucracy and riddled with red tape. To qualify for food or aid, families often had to give up their small plots of land. This was intended to reduce the number of small holdings, to push toward larger, more productive farms. But it meant that in order to eat, families had to render themselves homeless and jobless. The third year came, 1847. It should have been better. The blight eased slightly that year, and some potatoes were harvested. But by now, the people were too weak to plant, too ill to dig, too broken to hope. The hunger had done its work, not just on their bodies, but on the land itself. Farms were deserted, cottages stood empty, graves outnumbered cradles. Disease followed famine, as it always does. Typhus, dysentery, and relapsing fever tore through the weakened population. The workhouses became breeding grounds for death. Cities like Limerick and Cork, corpses lay in the streets, covered only by a scrap of cloth or a grieving relative. And still, the British Empire clung to its policies. Free trade must be upheld. Exports must continue. Order must be maintained. Any disruption, they believed, would be worse than the famine itself. In 1848, the blight returned with fury. It was now the fourth year of suffering. People who had once been proud farmers were reduced to skeletal wanderers. Children were left alone in cottages with the bodies of their parents. Priests and nuns buried the dead in mass graves, sometimes a dozen at a time. By now, the famine had become more than a tragedy. It was a defining event, a wound etched deep into the soul of Ireland. It altered the landscape not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and politically. The people were beginning to understand something terrible. No help was coming, not from their landlords, not from their government, not from the empire, under whose rule they suffered. The storm that had come with the blight was no longer just in the air. It was in the hearts of those who remained, and yet through all of this, Ireland still produced food. Beef, oats, butter, and grain were still harvested, still sold, still shipped to England. The system worked, but not for the people. It worked for the markets, for the landowners, for the empire. In a land of harvest, people starved, and those who watched it happen, those who justified it, who measured it with ledgers and charts, who called it providence or necessity, became something darker than negligent. They became architects of suffering. The famine did not end with one disaster. It stretched on year after year, grinding down a nation, and long after the fields had gone black, the scars remained, buried not in the soil but in memory. A blight had struck the earth. But it was policy, not disease, that made it a storm. In the darkest years of the Irish famine, the docks were not silent. They did not echo with hunger or desperation. They echoed with the sounds of commerce, of boots on wooden piers, crates being loaded, ship bells ringing, sails unfurling. At port cities like Cork, Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford, cargo ships left daily, their hulls heavy with food. The tide of empire was constant. It moved without pause, without empathy, without contradiction, except the one that haunted every crate. While people starved in the countryside, Ireland exported food. It was not a trickle. It was not the last remnants of a better year. It was mass exportation, sanctioned by law, enforced by policy, and protected by the crown. During the famine years, Ireland continued to send away hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, oats, barley, peas, beans, and animal products. The very soil that failed the poor still yielded harvest for the landlords. Those goods were not blighted. They were healthy, marketable, and sold for profit. How could this happen? How could the same land be a land of famine and abundance? The answer lay in the brutal efficiency of colonial economics. Ireland, though geographically close to Britain, was politically and economically treated as a resource colony. Its rich agricultural output was not meant for the Irish themselves, but for the empire. The British economy was built on trade, on predictable supply, stable contracts, and minimal interference. Disrupting food exports from Ireland, even during Niall's mass starvation, would risk upsetting those rhythms. So the government didn't stop it. It didn't even slow it down. In the halls of Parliament, the suffering of the Irish was not denied, but it was framed as unfortunate rather than urgent. There were speeches, inquiries, and newspaper editorials. Sympathy was expressed. Concern was voiced. But action remained tepid. The sacred principle of laissez-faire, the idea that markets should be left to their own devices, hovered over every decision. Government intervention, many believed, would distort trade, create dependency, and offend the invisible hand of commerce. So when local authorities begged for food depots to be reopened or exports to be halted, they were denied. Stopping. Food exports, officials argued, would not solve the famine. It would only disrupt the empire's stability. It would be unfair to the merchants who had contracts. It would be unjust to the landlords whose incomes depended on grain sales. And besides, they said, if people were starving, it was not because food was unavailable, it was because they couldn't afford it. And there it was. The great cruelty disguised as economic logic. Food, in the eyes of policy, was not a right. It was a commodity. If you had no money, no land, no purchasing power, then you simply had no claim to it. Hunger in this system was not a failure of the state. It was the natural consequence of poverty. And poverty, the British elite believed, was the Irish condition. They said the Irish were indolent, that they bred too much, drank too much, worked too little. They said Catholicism had made them superstitious, irrational, resistant to progress. They said the peasant class was backward, clinging to tiny plots of land and ancient traditions. So when the famine came, it confirmed all their prejudices. The Irish weren't suffering, they said. They were being taught a lesson. In newspapers, like the Times, the narrative was clear. The famine was terrible, yes, but it was also a necessary correction. It would force the Irish to modernize. It would rid the land of surplus population. It would break the old ways and make space for economic efficiency. This was the logic that permitted ships to sail from Irish harbors full of food, past villages, where people were dying in the ditches. This was the reasoning that allowed officials to sleep at night, while children were buried in shallow graves with bellies bloated from starvation. The records from these years are staggering. In 1847 alone, during the peak of the famine, Ireland exported 4,000 vessels filled with food. Approximately 3 million quarts of grain were exported, enough to feed every man, woman, and child in the country. There was bacon, butter, beef, flour, all moving out under armed guard, lest the starving masses attempt to seize it. At ports, British soldiers stood between the food and the people who grew it. They protected the property of the landlords, who continued to demand rent even as their tenants died. If rent could not be paid, eviction followed. If land was abandoned, it was taken over. The countryside became a graveyard, and the cities filled with the destitute. In the marketplace, famine didn't mean a shortage of food, it meant higher prices. Speculators bought up grain and held it, driving up the cost. Merchants, sensing profit, continued business as usual. To them, the famine was not a crisis, it was an opportunity, but in the cottages of the Irish poor, it was a death sentence. Imagine it, a family living on a farm that produces wheat, barley, and beef. But the wheat is exported. The beef is exported. And the family lives in a crumbling hut, boiling nettles for soup. They grow potatoes in the margins, and when those fail, they starve, surrounded by food, but denied by the market. Some tried to resist. In remote areas, desperate people attacked food convoys, stole bread from carts, raided the grain stores, but these were isolated incidents, quickly suppressed. The empire had no tolerance for rebellion, even in the face of starvation. Armed escorts were doubled. Punishments were severe. To steal food meant prison. To protest eviction meant exile. The law did not bend for hunger. In the shadow of death, the docks of Ireland told a different story, one of abundance, movement, and relentless commerce. As families buried their dead and children cried themselves to sleep on empty stomachs, ships continued to glide out of Irish harbors, their hulls heavy with food. Carts full of grain rattled down muddy roads toward the coast. Barrels of salted beef were loaded by laborers too weak to buy even a scrap of it. Butter churned from the best Irish milk was packed in crates and sealed for export. Not to the Irish. To England. You see, Ireland was still producing food. Lots of it. But the Irish weren't allowed to eat it. The grain belonged to landlords. The beef came from cattle raised on rented fields. The butter came from dairies owned by estate holders. All of it was property. And property, in the British Empire, had more protection than people. Throughout the Great Famine, Ireland remained a net exporter of food. An estimated 4,000 ships left Irish ports each year during the worst of the hunger, laden not with aid, but with sustenance bound for British markets. It wasn't that the country lacked food, it's that the people who grew it couldn't afford it. The government in London knew this, but they also believed in a higher power, the free market. Under Prime Minister Lord John Russell and influenced by the rising tide of laissez-faire economics, Britain refused to intervene in the natural operation of trade. Food prices, they argued, should not be artificially lowered. To give out free food, they warned, would discourage self-reliance and teach idleness. Instead, the poor were blamed. British officials described the Irish as lazy, ignorant, and superstitious. In Parliament, members debated whether the famine was a curse, sent by God to civilize a backward people. Charles Trevelyan, the man in charge of famine relief, said the disaster was a direct stroke of an all-wise providence, and that it would eventually correct the defects of the Irish character. And so they let them die. The logic of empire was cold and calculated. To intervene would be to undermine private property and disrupt the sacred laws of economics. To give food to the starving would be to reward poverty. Even as desperate Irish families collapsed in the fields, even as parents watched their children fade into skeletons, the ships kept sailing. The grain never stopped moving. The empire, after all, needed feeding. And Ireland? Ireland was just a farm, a colony, a place that produced for others and survived, if at all, on what was left behind.